right. So this is one of the topics that I was actually going to skip, but we can get through it pretty quickly. So we're kind of backtracking a little on the text, but this is pretty simple and straightforward. Linguistics is the academic study of language. I have a huge linguistics department here. If it's something you're interested in, certainly plenty of classes to be taken there. It's the reason why I kind of only do this briefly. Psycholinguistics is more the study of how people learn and use language. So this is the intersection between linguistics and cognitive science, cognitive psychology. So there are lots of different subfields here. Lots of interesting work being done in this area. It's just not an area that I've done a great deal of work in. I've done some language-related work because language is so tied in with memory. First thing we have to figure out is what do we mean by language? And languages are simply shared symbolic systems of communication. Now there are many different kinds of language. There's spoken, written, spoken and written, and just oral languages. So for example, we have American Sign Language. There are different kinds of sign language. It's not just American Sign Language. There are other kinds of sign language. Certainly English is spoken and written. Other things we don't know how to pronounce anymore because they are so long in the past and we only know them through written communication. So things like, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, that sort of thing. But these are simply symbolic systems of communication. Somebody somewhere will finally try to figure out where emojis fit into language. Not really sure. But somewhere in there is this shared symbolic of communication. So there are some universals of any language. Semanticity simply means that languages convey meaning. Arbitrariness, this is one of the universals of language, is there's not necessarily an inherent connection between the symbols and their meaning. Shakespeare figured this out long ago. Anyone know what Shakespeare's famous quote on this arbitrariness is? No? Yeah. There's probably more than one. The one I was thinking was a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? So just because we call it a rose, doesn't make it a rose. Does that make sense? It's just simply arbitrary. But yes, there are probably plenty more. So words is. I would have to say, not being a Shakespeare scholar, that was the one that came to my mind. But I think you're probably right. Flexibility of symbols, so we can change connections and invent new ones. The sort of language geeks event of the year is what are we going to add to the Oxford English Dictionary this year, right? Well, we're super excited when it was email. Selfie, I think, is now in the OED. These are kind of new connections between words and symbols that are associated with new meaning. It's sort of weird to think of a time before email, but there was such a time. Now, basically, that's all anyone gets. My mother has this weird connection with actual mail. She's always makes sure she goes out and gets the mail every day. If it weren't for her, I would probably check it once a week. Does anybody else do that with their snail mail, like once a week, once a month? I know Rich doesn't check his mailbox. Okay. I kind of wander past mine because I like to say hello to the admin assistants every day, but naming, we assign names to everything. This is where nouns come from. Finally, displacement. This is the ability to talk about other moments in time, so we can talk about our past and future. This is one of the ways in which, one more there is. So we can displace ourselves in time, so we can think about our past, we can talk about our future, we can read novels about futures, dystopian and otherwise. We can read novels about the past. And that's one of the universals of language, is it allows us to talk about other times, other places. So this displacement is another universal. And then finally, productivity. Language is an inherently creative process. We don't reproduce language. We actually produce it. Every time you speak a sentence, unless you're quoting someone, you're creating something new, right? Now, you're probably not the first person to create that, but it is a creative process. That is, you produce new language, new sentences all the time. So it is a creative process. What's interesting about that is there's really clear individual stylistic elements to language productivity. So some of the things I've been interested in some of language questions are, there are computer programs that say they can identify your writing. So if you submit a bunch of writing samples, it can then find your writing and your writing style and tell if you wrote it or not. There are others that, of course, compare the originalness of your paper to other created works. This is what Turnitin does. It takes your paper and compares it to other papers, not word for word, but sort of based on meaning. And it does this through this very complex process. But just to make sure that you have actually produced that language. Now, I think eventually it'll get to the point where it has too much data, right? The old philosophical question, if you have an infinite number of monkeys at an infinite number of typewriters, eventually they'll write everything ever written. I think eventually Turnitin will contain every possible combination of language, right? Because there's really just only so many ways to describe things like a just noticeable difference. So, how do we analyze language? This is where, again, some of the psycholinguistics come in and the linguistics come in. Grammar are simply the rules of language. Languages all have rules. The first of these is our phonology. They're just simply sounds and their combinations for spoken languages. Syntax, the appropriate word order and grammaticality. For those of you who shuddered when I put up the word grammar, we're not diagramming sentences today, I can tell you that. There are also lexical or semantic rules, which are related to their word meaning and integration of word meaning, how words modify one another. What's interesting about these is we learn them quite automatically. In fact, most of us have a sense of what is grammatically correct and what is not, even if we can't describe why it's not grammatically correct. You can simply kind of hear it and go, doesn't sound right. Same things with syntax, certainly word order, sounds. All of these we have an implicit sense of. And there's people who study this do things like artificial grammar structures, artificial grammar learning. That's usually when my eyes glaze over and I stop listening to what they have to say. Because it's interesting to them, but I'm more interested in how these things work in the real world. One of the things we talk about is the conceptual level of analysis. This is our analysis with reference to knowledge. So how does our language convey knowledge? How is it related to our knowledge? Another important component is belief. This is in reference to our own beliefs and beliefs about the speaker's intent. And this is where things have started getting very interesting in modern discourse, because there is a credibility gap with a lot of news sources, with a lot of other sources of information. This week, right here in the Believe It or Not file is, you all know who Alex Jones is, the founder of InfoWars. He was the sort of person who propagated the Pizzagate controversy. So he's this right-wing conspiracy nut job, I think, is a fair assessment of Alex Jones. Well, he's in the middle of a divorce, trying to get custody of his kids, and of course, unfortunately, they've got him on copious amounts of video, sounding ridiculous. And he's now claimed that he just plays a character, that no one should believe anything that he says because it's just a character that he's playing. So what happens next in that crazy bit of the world, I'm not sure. But if you ever watch him, he is completely nuts. What did Stephen Colbert call him? He's like a coked-up high school football player yelling from the scoreboard. That's essentially what Alex Jones looks like. Watch the Colbert. That was probably the funniest part of this. Anyway, that gets at belief. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about phonology. So phonemes are the basic sounds of language. Of course, each language has its own phonemes. This is one of the reasons why people learning English from other languages have difficulty with some pronunciation, because our phonemes are different. You've all struggled with this, too, when you learn new languages. Right? That rolling R you're supposed to learn for French. Probably Spanish, too. I don't know. My knowledge of foreign languages is quite limited. I can order about 9 beers in Spanish, and I can ask where the bathroom is. What more do you need to know, right? Although I suppose knowing what they say when they tell you where the bathroom is would be really handy. I just have to hope they point. But each language has its own set of consonant sounds, vowel sounds, etc. There are 3 variables that contribute to making consonant sounds. Place of articulation. So this is where in the vocal tract the airflow is disrupted. So sound is sort of towards the back of your throat, whereas the sound is towards the front of your tongue. And that's where you're disrupting the airflow. All hard consonant sounds have a disruption of airflow. Manner of articulation is how the airflow is disrupted. Is it a hard T or a the, which is a soft manner of articulation, or a sh versus ch, right? And then voicing is the timing of vocal cord vibrations. Again, we get at things like I feel ridiculous making these sounds, but hopefully I sound ridiculous too, because they're meant to be. But that timing of vocal cord vibrations, that sort of thing, gets at these 3 ways of making consonant sounds. Vowel sounds, there's no disruption of airflow, so it has to do with the placement of the mouth, front, center, back, e, oo, that sort of thing. Tongue position in the mouth, high, middle, and low. E. Do this at home and feel more ridiculous. But, a fair exam question might be, if you're making this sound, how is it different? Is it place of articulation, manner of articulation? What's the key difference between a consonant sound and a vowel sound? Consonant sounds, there is a disruption of airflow, whereas in vowel sounds, there's no disruption of airflow. Something like that would be a good exam question. Just saying. Any questions about phonemes? So these are the basic sounds of language, which we put together into spoken words. So we combine phonemes into words. And there are, of course, rules for combining phonemes into words. So there are basic ways that we construct our spoken language to make up phonemes. So our extensive knowledge of these rules is called our phonemic competence. That is, this is our understanding of how language is supposed to sound, or at least our language is supposed to sound. We have this remarkable ability to perceive language even though it's extraordinarily variable, and we call this the problem of invariance. We hear them all basically the same. While they'll have different accents, they'll sound different, we can still hear them as the same meaning, as the same kinds of sounds. So despite having, say, a different accent, we hear them as the same language. And in fact, even somebody who has a broken English accent, we can still understand, provided it's not completely broken, we can still understand what they're saying and catch their meaning. So this phonemic competence is our understanding of what language is supposed to sound like, but we have this ability to understand language from a variety of speakers, even though they all sound very differently. Everyone's voice is unique, at least mostly unique, but we still are able to hear them as being the same language. So that's a fairly remarkable ability. Any questions about phonemes or phonology? One of the things we also do is we overlap phonemes. That is, we don't stop one phoneme and then start another. We overlap them to create words. We call this co-articulation. One of the problems you probably have noticed when I speak is speak fairly quickly, and oftentimes there's very little in between words, and that's probably something I should work on fixing. But we co-articulate, so that is we overlap them together so as to create continuity of single words. So this co-articulation, so in co-articulation there is co-artic-u. Would sound ridiculous if we pronounce each phoneme on its own, so we co-articulate as we overlap those. Syntax then relates to appropriate word order. So English relies on word order to convey meaning probably more than any other language, which is one of the reasons why it's really difficult to learn English, particularly as a second language, because we modify meaning based on word order more than any other language. So these three words can be combined in three different ways to mean three completely different things. So we have a red fire engine, which is a fire engine of a particular color. Then we have fire engine red, which is a red of a particular shade. And then we have red engine fire, which we call a barbecue. Only kind of call them that. So if your car's on fire, we would call that a red engine fire. But these three words can be combined to mean three completely different things. And that's rather frustrating to people who are learning English for the first time, because our language is one of the few that does this kind of thing. Most would just simply have a different word for all three of these things. Phrase order, then, is the ordering of language word units that can influence meaning. So these would all be phrases by combining those words. We then order phrases that can influence meaning. Now this is where we could stop and have an hour-long argument about the Oxford comma. If you aren't familiar with that ongoing debate about whether or not to use the Oxford comma, turns out it's very important. Somebody completely just lost several $100,000 because their contract didn't include one single comma. So word order is particularly important in legal phrasing. So here we have Bill told the men to deliver the piano on Monday versus Bill told the men on Monday to deliver the piano. This one's actually more clear because he could be, in this sentence, either the piano's coming on Monday or he told them on Monday. But here, clearly, he told them on Monday, and we have no idea when the piano's coming, right? So simple changing of phrasing can completely clarify or declarify sentence meaning. One of the ways we analyze language syntax is through Chomsky's transformational grammar. We talked about Noam Chomsky at the very beginning of the semester. We talked about the sort of very famous dispute between Noam Chomsky and B.F. Skinner on the nature of language. So, according to Chomsky, we have a surface structure, a phrase structure, and a deep structure. The surface structure is simply the structure of the sentence as it is spoken or written. What is it on its surface? The phrase structure, then, is the underlying structure of a sentence based on meaningful phrases. So here we can break down a sentence like the dog chased the bicycle into two meaningful phrases. The dog chasing the bicycle. Then finally, we have the deep structure, which is an abstract representation of the meaning of a sentence. So this tells us what's happening in this whole sentence. So as you try to say, imagine what's happening in this sentence, that's that deep structure. What does it mean all the way, or what is it trying to represent? What is it trying to convey? So surface structure is simply the sentence as it is. Phrase structure, we break it out into individual phrases. And then deep structure is what does it mean? What kind of meaning does it convey? Now, according to this view, there are transformational rules And we use those to convert our deep structure, that is what we want to say, what we mean, into surface structure. So we take what we mean to say, transform it into actually produced language. We use these transformational rules to make that happen. Now, as I think you've probably no doubt figured out in your lives, oftentimes this doesn't happen right, right? You say something and it doesn't come out how you meant it to happen, right? Everyone's had that happen at least once. Words come out and you're like, wait, I don't think that's what I meant. So you can kind of think about that as a way to think about how this all works. Any questions about syntax? I'm kind of running through this quickly, but frankly, it's not that interesting. Try to make it as exciting as possible. So, lexical and semantic factors are part of this. The mental lexicon is our mental dictionary of words and their meaning. So a question of the lexicon or our lexical access is an important part of how we understand cognition. We're going to talk here in a little bit about lexical access in brain damaged patients very quickly. As we start talking about phonemes, we also think about morphemes, which are the smallest units of language that have meaning. So phonemes are the smallest sounds of language. Morphemes are the smallest units of language that convey meaning. So unhappiness has 3 different morphemes. Anyone identify what they are? I'll give you the easy one. Happy is one of them. Yeah. Yeah. Ness. Yeah. Right. Without ness, we're just unhappy, right? Which is, unhappiness is a state of being unhappy, right? If I'm getting that right. But yes, exactly right. So these all modify the meaning of the root word happy. Don't have flashbacks to grade school looking at root words, but there it is. What's unclear at this state of the science is if we access individual morphemes or whole words, which happens most quickly. I'm on the side that we tend to access whole words because we just understand the meaning. I don't think any of us stops, and if it happens very quickly to try to parse this out, right? No one does that. So our semantic knowledge and syntax are related. Our knowledge can override syntax in how we perceive and remember. And as we've talked about before, knowledge influences our perception and memory of language. This is where everything starts to kind of come together in a overall understanding of how all of this works together. One of the things we talked about is verbal overshadowing, right? That when people describe what they've seen in a crime, that verbal memory can override their visual memory. And so this is where our knowledge and language all start to kind of come together. We also, of course, know that our knowledge and our beliefs influence how we perceive language and what we think people said versus what they actually said, what we think we heard versus what they actually said. Anyone said something that somehow gets translated mid-air as it lands on somebody else's ears, and you go, wait, that's not at all what I said? My last job, I would sit in department meetings, and somebody would speak at this end, and somehow it would magically transform as it landed at that end of the table and be completely misinterpreted. So I never quite figured out what was happening there. I was convinced we just needed a new table because it was screwing up language. But it's our beliefs, it's our expectations, our own biases, all of that has effects on our perception of language. The last note to talk about before we move on to brain and language is to talk about discourse. Discourse is more about communication, understanding meaning and intent. So here we're talking about what the overall conveyance of language is. So both written and spoken language convey discourse. One of the ways that we talk about language is how conversations proceed. because of our shared assumptions and our shared beliefs, and this is about discursive discussions. This is where I think, again, there's more interesting work being done in processing of discourse, because this is how we communicate and how we think about persuasive language and trying to get people to help us out or do things like vote for someone. This is where we really get into how that works on an interpersonal level. So there are these kind of assumptions or maxims about good sort of discourse. The maxim of quantity: much is needed to be informative, but no more than needed. You think of this as that's too much information part of discourse, right? Once had this experience, right? I didn't need to know any of the rest of that. We could have stopped halfway through that sentence. Quality: say only what you believe to be true. Having a slight problem with this part of our current discourse at a national level. Relation: make your contribution relevant. Anyone have friends that will say things that just are part of some other conversation? Yeah. Like where did that come from? I'll usually try to explain how I got there if I do that. I used to have a colleague at one of my previous universities who was usually about 10 minutes behind, and so would say things that were relevant to the conversation from like 10 minutes ago, and so you would have to like back up in your head what was going on earlier in the conversation, because it was previously relevant, but no longer. And then finally, manner. You want to be clear, brief, and to the point. So these are things that make sort of smooth conversations if you can do quantity, quality, relation, and manner all in appropriate ways. Any questions about discourse? Okay, well, I've got a quick little top hat review. I can find it. There it is. So a quick little review of something we talked about today. While you fill that out, I'm going to go refill my water. Okay, so it looks like most of you got this right. The abstract meaning of a sentence and the deep part of that. Let's pick up then. Talk about brain and language. This will be relatively quick. Most primary disruptions of language are what we call aphasia. So aphasia is the disruption of language by some sort of brain injury. Primarily, this is due to ischemic stroke. So they get the blood clot, blocks off blood flow to their brain, causes disruption that way. memory serves, damage to the left mid-communicating artery is one of the sort of primary strokes associated with aphasia. That's off the top of my head. But generally, it's the left hemisphere, particularly for people who are right-handed. People who are left-handed tend to have less cerebral asymmetry in their language. But these kinds of strokes can result in some very specific kinds of damage to language systems, which tells us a lot about sort of how language is accomplished in the brain. So as we've done before, taking a look at these patterns of damage is one of the best ways we can look into how the brain's accomplishing language production, language comprehension, etc. You get some very odd, specific ways this happens. So the earliest research into sort of neuroscience and neuropsychology comes from Broca and Wernicke, who discovered patients with damage to what's called Broca's area, had specific language deficits, and with Wernicke's area, a similar, well, a very different form of aphasia. So this is a quick sort of summary of the different kinds of language-related disorders. Broca's aphasia is disruption in speech production, whereas Wernicke's aphasia is disruption in speech comprehension. So while Wernicke's aphasia is people have difficulty comprehending speech, Broca's aphasia, they can actually produce speech, but can't understand it. Conduction aphasia is this very odd type of aphasia where these two, Wernicke's and Broca's areas, get disconnected, and as a result, people can't repeat back words that were said to them. They can understand language fine. They can produce language perfectly fine, but they simply can't repeat things back to them because there's no connection between these two areas. Anomia, we've already talked about, is loss of nouns, so inability to name objects or things. There's also what's called pure word deafness, which is a perceptual disruption in the auditory pathway. So kind of like disruptions in pattern recognition, but disruption in word pattern recognition. And then finally, we have alexia and agraphia. Alexia is a loss of the ability to read or recognize printed letters or words, and people with agraphia who no longer have the ability to write. Here's where it gets weird. You can be alexic but not agraphic. That is, you can write, but you can't read what you have just written. Which I find very disturbing on a lot of levels. And the acalculia is also symbol related. This is a loss of mathematical abilities. And then, of course, we've already talked about agnosia and prosopagnosia. So Wernicke's aphasia is occurring here, right here at the occipital parietal temporal junction. Broca's aphasia occurs here in the frontal area, frontal temporal area, pretty close to the motor projections associated with speech. So, and then we have the auditory cortex. The information goes from auditory cortex to Wernicke's area, to Broca's area, for example, to repeat words back to you. So that's a quick introduction to different types of language disorders. A couple other notes I thought you would find interesting. Bilingualism, huge interest in the effects of bilingualism in cognition and intelligence and the difference between learning a language as an adult versus a child. So we do know that bilingual adults recover more easily from strokes. They have increased gray matter volume. They show reduced rates of dementia and later onset of dementia symptoms. Bilingual children show greater cognitive flexibility. We can see some of these benefits as early as 18 months. What's interesting is there appears to be a dramatic difference in how your brain sets up a second language if you learned it along with your first language. So in a truly bilingual home where you learn Spanish and English at the same time, they set up like right on top of each other, essentially. So your brain has all of the English and Spanish together. Whereas as an adult, or even late, even if it's As an adult, I mean past puberty, or in puberty even. Sort of once your brains, particularly its language centers, have set up, you now have to kind of add on a second language. So it gets stored as part of your acquired semantic knowledge. So it's completely different, both cognitively and from a neuroscience perspective, in terms of how those languages operate. So we see very big differences in how things like the false recognition paradigm we talked about, how that works in kids who were raised in a bilingual household versus somebody who learned a second language as an adult. They're much more likely to fall prey to that cognitive illusion in both or either language. So you can give them all the words in English, but they'll falsely recognize the Spanish equivalent of whatever that critical lure item was. So really interesting work being done in bilingual areas. So a couple of other things, we've talked about these already. Task switching seems to be better in bilingual adults. Some improved cognitive skills, improved decision making, some improved memory. Some really interesting benefits of being bilingual. All right, that's language. Any questions? Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's move on now